Yes, Mr. Manu.
Yeah. Friends, welcome to this very special meeting of the Madras Book Club. It is special because we have a literary celebrity, one of India's finest poets, interacting with a fine arts celebrity, one of India's foremost classical dancers. It's welcome Arundhathi Subramaniam and Alarmel Valli. Arundhathi has always been a spiritual seeker, intrigued by questions relating to birth, death, suffering, and the universe. All her life, she has read voraciously the works of mystics such as Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, J. Krishnamurti, Ramana Maharshi, and many others. She has written several books and brought out several anthologies focusing on spirituality. The best known, perhaps, are her book on the Buddha and a biography of Sadhguru Jaggi Vasudev. Her latest book, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, is the book of the evening. It provides glimpses into the lives and teachings of 4 relatively unknown women mystics. It is both a revelation and a celebration. Shashi Tharoor says, this portrait of ordinary, incredible people is a wonderful reflection of South India's many paths to a higher power. The 4 women are Sri Annapurni Amma, who lives in an ashram at the village of Chinnalambadi in Tamil Nadu. Balarishi Vishveshwarasani, who lives in an area of thriving palm trees between Coimbatore and Palakkad. Lata Mani, a writer and filmmaker who lives in California. And Ma Karpuri, who lives in an ashram near Coimbatore. We'll hear all about them in the conversation between our 2 celebrities. Arundhathi has written 13 books of poetry and prose. She has taken part in international poetry conferences and festivals in the US and several countries of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Her work has been translated into half a dozen languages, including Italian, German, French, and Spanish. She has been showered with honors, to mention just a few: the International Seppo Prize for Poetry in Italy, the Z Women's Award for Literature, the Trinity Arts Festival Lifetime Achievement Award. This is a highly edited version. One could say a lot about Arundhathi, but I'm confining myself to the minimum. She's a beautifully articulate speaker. Madras Book Club members may recall her brilliant Founders Day lecture 2 years ago on Does Poetry Make Anything Happen? She describes English as an Indian language. It is as Indian as cricket and democracy. And that's delightful for a cricket aficionado like myself. Alarmel Valli is a legend of Bharatanatyam. Her many awards include the Padma Bhushan and the Padma Shri, and a top award from the French government. She has performed at prestigious international venues such as the Bolshoi Theatre, the Edinburgh Festival, the Kennedy Center, the Venice Biennale, the Salzburg Festival, many others. She has inspired several films on her art, including a documentary by the BBC. Alarmel Valli has said in an interview, dance for me is sheer joy. Dance for me is sheer joy at different levels, from the sublimely spiritual to the vibrantly physical, from the purely intellectual to the intensely emotional. I'm sure today's discussion between Arundhathi and Alarmel Valli will also be sheer joy. The format for this evening's program is that Arundhathi will first talk about her book. We'll then have a dialogue between her and Alarmel Valli. I request the audience to type out their questions in the chat box as usual. Jayanti of the Madras Book Club will read out the questions for the 2 panelists to answer. And we'll then have a vote of thanks. Over to you, Arundhathi.
Thank you so much, Madhu. Thank you very much indeed for that particularly thoughtful and generous introduction. It also feels very good to be back again, thanks to your invitation to the Madras Book Club. I have happy memories of that interaction 2 years ago at your Founders Day program, and I'm delighted and honored to be back again. And what I particularly look forward to is a conversation with someone who isn't just one of the artists whom I admire enormously, but someone who has also grown over the years into a genuine friend. So I look forward to this conversation a very great deal. I've had several sessions around this book, Madhu, and I want to say this to all members of the book club. You know, what I really look forward to is a conversation around it, because there's almost everything that I feel I needed to say about this book has been said. But, and Madhu has also introduced it very beautifully. So there's very little that remains, other than perhaps for me to say before I invite Valli to join this conversation. Perhaps the only thing I would like to say is the fact that this book had its beginnings in what I describe in the preface as a twinge. The twinge that I have often felt when I think of all the voices that haven't been heard simply because they fall on the wrong side of a historical or cultural or gender divide. And I grew up as a Rasika and a student of English literature. I was delighted to have read all the great poets from Keats to Wallace Stevens. And I feel my life was enormously enriched by that Anglo-American canon to which I was heir. But I also realized that there were innumerable voices that I would never hear simply because they fell on the wrong side of certain divides. And so I realized, as a writer and as a reader of literature, I realized that there is a way in which I could navigate my life, claiming other voices, other ancestries, learning to listen closely to voices that are often muted, trivialized, sidelined, into a hatred of all the dead white male writers whom I had grown up with. So acknowledging these four women was, I think, an attempt that was essentially undertaken with a twofold objective. One, the need to listen to the quieter voices, the unsung voices, the undocumented voices, a need to tune into those, particularly in a world where we are surrounded by the deafening clamor of opinion, prejudice, and of course the endless drone of social media. In that world, to be able to tune in to the quiet voice, the murmured voice, this is one of the reasons for this book. And the other reason is the women themselves. And the fact that they reminded me of just what it takes to be a spiritual traveler. And the fact that in the course of my conversation with them, they flouted, they disrupted, they disconcerted me from the very beginning, but they always compelled me to question any kind of pat stereotypic notion that I might nurse about what it means to be spiritual. And so I say in this book that these are women who remind us that one doesn't have to look like a placid boiled egg in order to be on this journey. These are tempestuous women, fiery women, extraordinary women, unknown women. That for me is, in short, the introduction to this book called Women Who Wear Only Themselves, and which I hope some of you will be inclined to pick up at some point. Valli, could I invite you to join and look forward to this conversation with you? You'd need to unmute yourself.
Well, thank you for inviting me, the Madras Book Club. You've given me an opportunity actually to speak with someone who's not just a dear friend, but who has been a muse for many years. Someone whose books have inspired me, exhilarated me, always touched me and illuminated me. So to be here to talk to Arundhathi is a joy. And I'm sure it will also be an education just listening to her talk about the book. But without taking more time, I just want to say, Arundhathi, before I launch into any questions about the book, I want to tell you that that book was a revelation to me, an absolute revelation, because I knew it was going to be a book about spirituality and mysticism. And I thought I would be reading about women who inhabited a kind of rarefied plane of existence. Though knowing you, I should have guessed that in that case you wouldn't have written about them. But what was exhilarating and astonishing was that these supranormal women really were accessible. And they were extraordinary women, are extraordinary women. But you don't necessarily have to be, at least this is what I feel, a profound seeker or a great spiritual traveler to enjoy this book or to find meaning in it. Because in the first place, these are incredible, fascinating stories in themselves. And you're a master storyteller. So that itself makes for a completely absorbing experience. But not just that, I think if anyone's groping for answers, if anyone is confused, conflicted, I certainly learned a lot. I made discoveries as I was reading the book. I've read it twice, and I'm sure the third time round I will probably discover much more. And I thought that all these women, though they were startlingly diverse and different in their experiences and approach to the sacred, they all speak this language of love, compassion, inclusivity, and tolerance, which I thought was vitally relevant for our times. So, this is a book which is, for me, a very precious book, an inspiring book. Reading about these remarkable, extraordinary women of courage was, as I said, a revelation, an illumination. So thank you for this, Arundhati. And if I may start with a very obvious question, which is the cover. The moment I opened the parcel, the image came leaping out at me against that vibrant, rich red, which immediately evoked Devi. And then the thread encircling the images, which I thought brought to mind the textile and clothing metaphor of your title, which was again so intriguing and beautiful. So how did you find this powerful, evocative image for the cover? Could you explain the symbolism for the cover and the title?
I'll come to the cover. I'll start with the cover and move to the title, Valli. But thank you. Thank you for reading twice over, and thank you for reading with the kind of generosity that you have clearly read with. You know, when you finish a manuscript, you actually don't want to see very much more of it. You pack it off and you really want to go out and do something else. You know, meet a friend, have a coffee, do something else entirely. You don't really want to start thinking about it. Sorry?
Too spiritual book or something.
Sorry.
Too spiritual book or something. Spiritual.
Galaxy J6, can you please mute?
Yeah, I think
Galaxy J6, please mute.
Yes, there's an echo.
Admin can mute all. Admin,
Can you mute them, please? Where is that coming from? I can't find the...
No, admin can mute all.
I have, yeah. Okay, let me mute everyone and the speakers can unmute.
Yeah.
Sure. Done. Yes, Arundhati, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So when you finish a book, you actually don't want to think very much about it. At least I don't. I'm happy to send it off and leave a lot of the decisions subsequently to the publisher. But when they asked me what I would like on the cover, the first person who came to mind was this artist and friend, Arpana Kaur, whom you know of, I'm sure, Valli. She's an extraordinary artist. And even in my earlier book, which you know of, Eating God, which was an anthology of Bhakti poetry, I had wanted an image by her, although the publisher eventually decided that it was better to go with something more neutral. So when I asked her to send me images, and she sent me this whole bushel of startling visuals, the one that I veered towards from the very start was this one, for the very reason you mentioned. One, because it is, of course, the color of the goddess. It's the there's vermilion. It evokes hibiscus, vermilion, blood, fertility, everything that I had wanted to suggest. But also because of this image of the women, and maybe I should hold this up if I can at this point. The women here, you see two of them, one with a pair of scissors and the other sewing. And it struck me that there couldn't be a more distilled evocation visually of this book. When I speak of women who wear themselves and only themselves, I'm talking of those who know that the process of growing into yourself is necessarily one of shedding, paring away, whittling down, therefore the scissors, but it is also a process of crafting, of sewing, of creating. And I think we know this, Valli, you certainly know this in your dance. I know it's something I'm aware of in my poetry, that the process of creating a piece of work involves just brutally sometimes paring away. It's not about allowing any kind of superfluity, textual superfluity. And at the same time, it is not just about revelation, it is also about composition. So I wanted the dual sense of composition and revelation in this book. Even the woman, Annapurni Amma, that Madhu mentioned, the very first woman in this book, she's a woman who actually spends much of her time naked. She is a naked woman mystic. And at the same time, I see her as a woman who isn't merely stripping away external identity. I also see her as a woman who has exercised a conscious choice to wear herself the way she wants to wear herself. I speak of her as a woman who wears her body, not as a woman who's completely disregarded it. So that's how the image happened. And as for the title, I was writing the introduction to this book. And as I wrote it, this particular phrase emerged. And I realized, okay, that's interesting. Perhaps this phrase could be the title. Women who wear or seek to wear only themselves. That is the line in the book. And it felt like Women Who Wear Only Themselves was indeed the title. I later tried to change it, but my publisher was absolutely adamant that it would have to stay this way.
In fact, when I read the title, and it's a title which has intrigued a number of people, there was another thought, and that was that you were actually also describing yourself. Because in many ways, I think of you that way, as someone who is so completely exactly what you said, all that you said.
I think I'd say, Valli, that I'm on a journey, certainly, of trying to wear only myself. But it's a journey, and it's an ongoing and unfolding journey.
It's a thought. But I wanted to also ask you, I drew so much of inspiration from Eating God, your edited anthology of Bhakti poetry. In fact, thanks to that book, I think I discovered a whole range of the most amazing, diverse female voices And I think my dance and repertoire are actually the richer for it, thanks to Eating God and the work that we've done together. And not long before the pandemic, I remember you mentioning that you wanted to bring out a book on female mystics,
Yes.
and also the male voice writing in the female voice, male poets writing.
Mhm.
So with this latest book, you've traveled far ahead in time to contemporary women mystics inhabiting a completely different world. So was women who were only themselves already in the offing 2 years ago, or was it in some way catalyzed by the pandemic?
That's such a good question, Valli. You know, Valli, you mentioned earlier, you talked of some of my work, and through my work, sometimes my serving as your muse. I wanted to say to you that had I seen more of you during the pandemic, I might have actually worked on that compilation of female voices in mystic poetry, which was always the intention. It's still underway, it's on somewhere, but it's on the back burner. And the reason it's on the back burner, I think, is because there was a particular joy in the making of Eating God, this anthology of Bhakti poetry that happened 5 years ago. The joy was that of knowing that one could create um, ways of converging with artists of all kinds, you know, musicians, dancers. In fact, it led to an entire festival, if you remember, in Mumbai at
Yes.
CPA. And I should just say this for those who perhaps aren't aware of this, that I actually invited Valli to perform Annamacharya, the 15th century Telugu mystic, and it led to a much, deepening collaboration. And that was an exciting time, I think, for me, certainly, because it was actually an opportunity to see the poet emerge from the page, from those magnificent translations, into the body of a dancer. So that was an entire journey on its own. And you're absolutely right, Valli. The concern was the preoccupation now has been with women's voices or the female voice. What happens even to the male poet when he's able to speak in the female voice? This is what fascinates me. And I was reading all those mystics and marinating in them until one day, a couple of people sent me the transcripts of 2 of these interviews that I had conducted a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And when I started reading those transcripts, I was suddenly seized by the aliveness of these conversations. And as I read, especially Annapurni Amma and Balarishi, the first two subjects of this book, I knew immediately that I had to attend to this. And if I didn't attend to this, it's not just that the interviews would date, but I would lose some of this sense of this voltage that was in some way emanating from the text, for want of a better word. I think one can be allowed to be just a little mystical. So I'm going to use the word voltage when talking about them. There was an electricity in those words somewhere. And I kept trying to think of the best way to transpose that on the printed page. And that's when I decided it would actually make sense to bring in 2 more voices. When I thought of a couple of women in my life whom I've met over the past decade, who have in fact transformed my life in their own ways. And those are Latamani and Ma Karpuri. One of them I happen to know particularly well, Ma Karpuri, and Latamani too, but somewhat differently. And that's when I realized it is important to acknowledge very often the people who might be right beside us and whom we often don't validate sufficiently, simply because the world is constantly encouraging us to look in another direction. And yet my life had been hugely enriched by these conversations with these women. So this was my tribute to contemporary women. It unfolded into that. But at some point, I hope that I will return to those women mystics of the past. And I hope that you and I will perhaps attempt another collaboration.
Yes, that is something which I'm certainly looking forward to post-pandemic. But I'm very glad for
Well, there
one.
is such a thing, but we will find out.
But I'm certainly glad that you wrote this book, because for me, as I said, that I felt enriched and illuminated by this book. So thank you. I'm glad you wrote this. In your preface, Arundhathi, you've written with your characteristic clarity and insight into mysticism. And I must confess that while I certainly believe that there are more things in heaven and earth than I dreamt of in your philosophy, when it comes to mystical experiences, paranormal manifestations, I still tend to be skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
And we are a credulous people, extremely gullible even when it comes to matters spiritual. If you don the garb, the costume, you talk the talk, and you know the jargon, then you're revered as a god, man, woman, other. And we have legions of self-proclaimed mystics claiming to have direct experience of the divine. So in this scenario, how do you know who is a true mystic? How do you recognize the truth? You've said there is no way to experience someone else's interiority, but there are many ways to sniff out realness. And you say that Annapurni Amma smells real. Can you speak about that, elaborate a little on that?
It's a good question, Valli, and I think it's a question for many people. It is a question for me. So the first thing I will say is, for all my years of active spiritual seeking, I have never seen skepticism at loggerheads with spiritual seeking. In fact, I think the two go hand in hand in many ways. There is a difference between skepticism and cynicism. Cynicism is an unwillingness, in a sense, a deep investment in not being surprised. Skepticism is not about an investment. Skepticism is just about the acknowledgement of questions, the acknowledgement of doubt. And I don't think there is any journey of faith that has not been routinely punctuated by doubt. So I don't see skepticism as an enemy at all of the journey in quest of the sacred. I don't see it as an adversarial relationship. But what did I mean when I talked of these women and the way in which some of them smelt real to me, particularly Amma, Annapurni Amma? Let me say this. I also say this in the introduction, Valli. I say that I'm not in a position to judge these women's spiritual attainments, and I don't claim to. So I'm not here to advocate them as the gurus of tomorrow. This is not a hard sell endeavor at all. It's not my attempt to say, to wave a flag on their behalf. Why am I writing about them? I'm writing about them because, one, they're just fascinating stories. I mean, what do you say about a woman who chooses to live the way Annapurni Amma does, who calls us in, and we see this woman inhabiting her body fearlessly, this naked body, fearlessly? What can you say? I mean, what can you do but not be fascinated? How can you not be curious? And what do you say about this other woman who is able to baladishi, who's able to say to her, one of her disciples, here I am, I'm going to wear a pair of jeans today, take a photograph, put it up on the net, because this is how I also want to be remembered. I'm not a woman who just wears ochre and turns into, your idea of what a rishi is. In fact, she chooses not to wear ochre at all. She chooses to wear on what she chooses to wear. She wears white, and sometimes she chooses, as she decides, to wear a pair of jeans, and that's fine with her too. And so each one of them, in their own way, is a fascinating story. There is a third woman who is driving to work one day. She's an academic, a mystic, a Marxist, a feminist driving to work. She has a head-on collision with a Pepsi truck on the freeway in California and is catapulted into this fog, a world of brain injury. And it's a trauma from which she is still to recover, except that she was also catapulted, as she says, in the process, into a new neighborhood, which is for her, the neighborhood of the sacred. How can one not be intrigued by that story? And there is the fourth woman, Ma Karpuri, who speaks of being this, she's really a feisty and a spunky young girl. She even bites a nun in her school. She's one of those disobedient, unruly young women who today remains an intense and fiery older woman, except that somewhere along the way, she's also turned from a working woman and a married woman into a monk. Am I saying this is the blueprint for everyone? No. Am I saying any of these women has to be our role model? No. But I'm certainly saying, one, that they are fascinating, and two, I do believe it takes exceptional courage to be able to live out this kind of parallel life, this kind of alternative life, in the face of a world that has its own set of very dogmatic formulae about how we ought to live and how we ought to belong. So I think I approached them. That's really what I would say. That's why I think the book, I hope, will be read and enjoyed by people of all persuasions, because the attempt is really not to evangelize. I'm certainly not attempting to lead the life of any of these women, but I think it's in how they lead their lives that they can be inspiration. It's not the what of their lives that matters. Can one be a skeptic? By all means. As one reads them, one can be a skeptic. They sometimes talk of paranormal experiences. Is that what makes them authentic? No. What makes them authentic, I would say, Valli, is two things that I've always maintained are very important for me when I'm in the presence of when I'm in a conversation. When I look back on a year, or I look back on the past 5 years, or I look back on a decade, I can often identify conversations or encounters with certain people that have shifted something in my perspective of life in a subtle and enduring way. And when I think of those conversations, I realize these two things. One, they were conversations in which I realized that the other person was being so vulnerable, so authentic, that I didn't want to be anywhere else. There was no restlessness in me at all. I wanted to be nowhere but here. And that for me is what happened when I happened to have these conversations, that these were women who were not trying to push an agenda. They were not trying to grab my attention. They were not asking me to write about them. They were not trying to in any way impress me, flaunt their credentials, win recruits, none of that. But I wanted to be nowhere except in their presence in the course of those hours that I spent with them. And the second index that I often use is one that I think Paul Brunton, the writer, speaks of more evocatively than I ever can. When he describes his first encounter with his guru, Ramana Maharishi, he's this insular British journalist. He's a man with a quest, but he's also a somewhat, by his own admission, a somewhat not just skeptical, but sometimes scornful rationalist. And he says in that first encounter that he felt, as he sat in the presence of this sage, that this was a sage who he didn't talk to him. He just sat in his presence. And he says, while sitting in his presence, it's not that I found my answers. It's just that my questions fell away. And I think that is something that many of us recognize in moments that are deeply real. You turn, or I turned in all these conversations at a certain point in each one of them, I turned from interlocutor to listener. That doesn't mean I don't have questions, but for that period of time, they fell away.
I must say that I already came to the book predisposed to believe, because I know that as far as you're concerned, and I do believe, I'm saying this not just for effect, but anything you say or have done has always been authentic, has always been true. So I came predisposed to believe, and I must say that by the time I had read the book, like you, I too became a listener. I too was completely caught up in their journeys and believed. So I think you managed to do that the way you write and the way you have spoken about them with that urgency and conviction. So that came through wonderfully. Thank you for that. In that last segment in the book about Ma Karpuri, Arundhati, you've spoken of self-combustion being the you've spoken about self-combustion being the resort of so many women of intensity. And you say, I believe I might have burnt myself up too if I hadn't found a guided spiritual path before that, poetry. In your, I don't know if you remember, in your very early 20s, you came home to do an interview for a Bombay newspaper.
I do remember. Yes,
And
Times of India. Yes.
Yes, and you wrote on choreography. It was not a subject we spoke about a lot in those days in dance. And I'll never forget, my mother and I were thinking, oh, she's so young. What is she going to write? And then you came out with this. It was perhaps one of the most insightful, analytical, and precise and very, very wonderful pieces that has ever been written on me. So I think that in the preface, you mean that you write in the human cycle that there are multiple daily triggers for profound inner transformation. From that young Arundhati, there's been a huge trajectory and a huge arc to where you are now. So can you share some of the transformative triggers in your journey as a seeker? You've also spoken of a near-death experience. And in the poems that you've woven in the book, so wonderfully apt and telling. Could you read a poem for us?
Oh, Valli. Sometimes it's difficult to know where to start. So I'm almost inclined to read a poem and escape from the question. But it took me back for a moment when you mentioned that interview, because it took me back to a long time ago. And you're absolutely right, a lot has changed. But when I think back on that first encounter, it was an early encounter with you and your mother. I do remember that. I also remember watching you as a starry-eyed woman in the second row of the NCPA in Mumbai, watching you perform at the Tata Theatre. And who knew that this was going to unfold, a conversation with you that has lasted decades. Let me say this, Valli. I'll say that on one level, much has changed. On another, not much at all. I was a listener at that conversation. I'm a listener today. It is the same quality of listening that drew me to many of the conversations I had in my 20s as a young journalist with several artists who have just nourished my understanding of culture and life immeasurably. But throughout all those years of journalism, in my own head, in my own self-definition, I thought of myself at the time as a poet. I still do. I was writing poetry. I was part of a group of poets called the Poetry Circle. I was writing, doing some amount of publishing, all of that. I think the difference is that in those days, I actually believed that most of my answers were going to come from the arts. And, it's amazing, Valli, how many of them did, because the arts were the only place where it seemed kosher to wonder about life and death and pain and, to actually be able to articulate uncertainty, to be able to articulate a complex and contrary truth. Literature for me was the one place where I could do that, where I didn't have to sound like I had the conclusions that the whole world around me seemed to have, whether they were ideological or scriptural. I didn't have conclusions, and literature was a wonderful place to be able to share that sense of wonder, that sense of not knowing. And that's what drew me to artists across the board, dancers like you, theater people, musicians. I mean, that seemed enough for many, many years. Until one day in 1997, when I had an experience that that was for me a brush with, I tried to talk about this at different stage, at different junctures, in different ways. And I'm trying to bring a freshness into the way in which I even speak of it, because I don't want to turn it into any kind of glib articulation. That is not how I experienced it. It was for me a brush with emptiness. And in my experience, it was not psychological and it was not physical. I was not unwell and I was not depressed. I was just more alive than I had ever been, but I was also more empty than I had ever been. And I had been in that phase, I was completely deserted by language. So it was for me the most chastening experience, also terrifying, because many of the things that I thought mattered to me suddenly seemed utterly shadowy. And as I emerged from that period, Valli, which actually only lasted a week, but it was an intense and transformative week. As I emerged from that, the one thing that was clear to me is that all my answers couldn't come from poetry. A lot of joy did, a lot of pleasure came from poetry. But I began to realize something else, that poetry is not just about language. Poetry is not just about the sensuousness of sound. Poetry is also about the pause. And without the pause, there will be no rhythm. Rhythm in itself is pause, sound, as you know, only too well as a dancer. So I realized I had enjoyed sound, but it was now time to make my peace with some of those silences that also need to punctuate one's engagement with sound. So I think that was one turning point. But because you also mention that line about intensity, I will say this because I know that I meet many, many people, many of them are women, with whom those particular lines have resonated about self-combustion being the resort of so many women of intensity. I think you don't have to have had to be a poet to be that. Many people have experienced this. And the thing with intensity is you don't really know what to do with it sometimes. You either char yourself or you char the world or someone around you. How do you deal with intensity? So for me, my journey really became about how to transform all that heat. How does one transform that into light? How does one transform intensity and voltage, to go back to that earlier metaphor? How does one transform that into something that is still alive, molten, and at the same time subtle? That's my quest, I think, today in poetry. Not to turn into a cabbage when I speak of tranquility. Many people think the spiritual journey is about cabbagehood. As far as I'm concerned, it's not about turning into some kind of lifeless cabbage, and nor is it about turning into a heap of ash. Somewhere between these two unfortunate extremes, there has to be another way to navigate the journey. And for me, a certain guided practice became an utterly indispensable way of navigating that journey, just a daily practice. What also interests me about these four women is that, diverse though they are, one speaks of yoga, the other speaks of tantra, the other speaks of bhakti, but all of them have a daily practice, a very non-glamorous, undramatic daily practice.
Much of what you say resonates with me, about whether it is about daily practice, sadhana, it is vital for us as dancers, and also what you said about blank spaces, pauses. For us, it's as important to be aware in music, in poetry, when you're choreographing, of the pauses between words, spaces between notes. It's something we've discussed, you and I, quite a bit. But you said something about language deserting you, and if I can, we can talk about language. You know, in your, I've always envied your gift with language. The way in which you shape and play with words, meaning, metaphor, with such felicity, it's magical. And for me, one of the great joys of reading this book was also the language and the format, where you introduce and conclude each story segment with these wonderfully apt poems that clarify, at least for me, they clarified and heightened the experience of the narrative. Also, I don't know if I'm imagining it, but it seemed to me that the tone and color of your language changed with each seeker. When you were talking of Annapurni Amma, it was fiery, vibrant, startling as she is. And you said she wore her nakedness casually. The body garment she wrapped almost abstractedly around herself. And when you speak about Balashi Shirasini, it is, for me, it seemed like cool moonlight and delicate filigree. You know, there's a part there when you say, you talk about, we sat, you say a voice that zigzagged between gravity and star song. We sat in silence for us, drinking in that kinetic flurry, that shimmer and dissolve of radiant sound. So beautiful. You know, your text is poetry for me. When you speak of Lata Mani, I thought it was very analytical, cerebral, and scientific. And when you portrayed Ma Karpuri, your language was intimate, tender, admiring, humorous. In fact, it had me smiling broadly very often. You spoke of Ogden Nash's poem when, you know, when she, speaking of feisty courage, you say she met a hideous giant and she briskly chopped off his head and sailed on with business as usual. If I can say this without being irreverent, I think when I read what you had written, particularly about Ma Karpuri, on the one hand, I felt like going and touching her feet with reverence. On the other, I felt like hugging her. When you write about the
I'm so
dacoits.
glad you say that. That is precisely how I feel about her. So I'm so glad you say that.
I'd love to hear you your thoughts on language, whether in the context of the parallel language of the seekers, or whether your quest for what you call a language of integration of your own. And I definitely think you should read a poem. You haven't read a poem, Arundhathi.
Should I read a poem first? And
Yes, please.
You know, I'm glad the wonderful thing about talking to an artist is that they think in images. I was just pausing right now when I heard you speak of the movement from fire to moonlight. And you're right, the Lata Mani account is much more intellectual. And yet even there I was guided by an image, which is the image of the tree and what it takes to be a tree. And that's the title of that particular segment. And what it means to be a redwood tree is that segment. Yes. And then there is, yes, the Ma Karpuri one where there is tenderness, there is humor, and I wanted it to be the absolutely last account in the book because I knew that there was a very decisive shift in approach there. And that shift happens because this is someone I know. And I wanted it to be the portrait of a friend. I wanted it to be the portrait of a monk. I wanted it to be both. And my inspiration for that, I would say, other than the subject herself, is also a book by Aubrey Menon. I'm trying to remember the name. I think it's called The Mystics. I used one of his essays in an anthology I did for Penguin some years ago called Pilgrim's India. And it's the last essay in his book where he speaks of a Swedish woman. And he describes her in detail, her cheekbones, her approach to life, her relationship with her husband. We never hear her name. And he speaks of her journey from this quiet domestic life in Stockholm, I think, to this life as a sannyasi in India. And it became the portrait of an individual. It also became a broader template of the journey from householder to monkhood. And I think that was somewhere at the back of my mind when I was writing the Ma Karpuri account, where I wanted the sense of irreverence and joy, and hence the Ogden Nash poem about Isabel that some of you might know. She's a utterly inimitable child, the kind of child you don't want to know, But she is the kind of child who must be documented and immortalized in nonsense verse, as Ogden Nash does. And at the same time, I wanted the sense of great respect. And I think this is true of my own approach to bhakti. Valli, and you and I have discussed this a great deal. For me, bhakti is not about deference. Bhakti is not about servitude. Bhakti is not about a great show of subordination. In fact, bhakti is a journey away from hierarchy. So this ability to speak with irreverence and affection all at once is for me at the heart of the bhakti experience. On that note, I'd like to read a poem called Tongue. Since you speak of language, this is a poem in the book, and it is a poem that starts with a very mundane image of which you will hear right now, but it is also about the quest for a language of integration, a language that makes room for the mundane and the miraculous all at once. Tongue. It has an epigraph by John Berger, who says, "The tongue is alone and tethered in its mouth." Tongue. The man in front of me is reading a balance sheet. He is smiling, his gaze shimmying between columns, effortlessly bilingual. And though a little drunk on the liquor of profit, I like to think he is not immune to the sharp beauty of integers simmering with their own inner life. And I wonder if he feels the way I do sometimes around words, waiting for them to lead me past the shudder of taproot, past the inkiness of groundwater, to those places where all tongues meet. Calculus, Persian, Kokborok, flamenco, the tongue that sparrows know, and accountants, and those palm trees at the far end of holiday photographs. Your tongue, mine. The kiss that knows from where the first songs sprang, forested and densely floral. The kiss that knows no separation.
Thank you for that, Arundhathi. Thank you. And I hope you will definitely read, because, you know, your poetry just, for me, just seeps down, permeates. I don't even have to think. I just experience it, and it's such joy and beauty. So thank you for that. You know, you spoke about, while you were talking, something occurred to me, which is that, you know, you have said that mysticism, you point out, results in a transformation, and that it causes a marked rise, you say, of freedom, joy, equality, inclusiveness, and the absence of dogmatism.
Mm-hmm.
But the general perception of spirituality and the sacred can so often be dogmatic and blinkered. And in fact, I think in the Lata Mani segment, you describe the human psyche as a great plural forest. And she says that our spiritual teachings are unitive philosophies. So I sometimes wonder, what is it about the human psyche that makes us so susceptible to blind faith, prone to accepting passive surrender, or even to embracing fundamentalism? All the four seekers in your book are emphatic that faith is vital.
Yes.
But how does a seeker walk that, negotiate that razor's edge without falling into clawing subservience on the one, or dismissive cynicism?
Such a good question, and I wish I had an answer to this. I would love to respond to this in all kinds of ways. As you speak, I'm inclined to. I just want to say this. One is, dogmatism happens not as a consequence of any genuine experience of life itself. A concentrated, intense, powerful experience of life very seldom, almost not very seldom, will never lead to dogmatism of any kind. I think this I'm completely certain of. And it explains why We never encounter it among the mystics, really, never, when we read the mystic poetry from across traditions, irrespective of the tradition that we're reading it from. There is no dogmatism at work. Dogmatism, I think, comes from, one, the fact that the human mind is so deeply fraught with hierarchy, and that need to hold on to hierarchy because we are so deeply afraid of diversity. I think this to me is something that I see time and again, and I encounter time and again, not just in the religious sphere, not just when I meet people of any particular faith, but as much when I meet people when they have heated political arguments or when they have heated cultural debates. The same sense of cleaving to a unitary position. I like this, and therefore this is the only way. I am drawn to this, therefore this must be the way for everyone. This fundamental inclination, I think, is the problem. I was trying to explain this to someone who just wrote to me 2 days ago and asked me why I didn't approach someone whom he regarded with great respect and whom I do too. Why I didn't approach that person with more deference. And I realized that this is primarily it, that for most people, the journey towards the sacred is perceived as a journey of hierarchy. Worshipping the divine means being afraid of the divine. The Bhakti poets tell us that you don't have to be God-fearing. The Bhakti poets are not interested in being God-fearing. They are God-possessed. They're not interested in fawning and gushing and propitiating their gods. They want to embody the divine. That is just how brazen they are. That is how ambitious they are. That is how crazy they are. You know, and so I think that's the reason for my passion for those poets, and it's one that we share, I know. And Annamacharya, the poet whom you and I have actually collaborated on a production over, reminds us of this again and again, doesn't he, Valli, in his poems where he speaks in the female voice. There is finally no hierarchy between the bhakta and her god. No hierarchy at all. You know, those poems remind us time and again that that hierarchy is an illusion of the mind, that the oneness, the essential the seamlessness of this relationship between the human and the divine is really what counts. And that's what the Bhakta asserts time and again. So that's a very short, I'm not sure I've completely answered your question, but I think it addresses some of those concerns, I hope.
You can write volumes about this, I know, but it has thrown up two other thoughts while you were saying this.
I'm just going to pause for a moment, Madhu, okay. And I want to ask Madhu, I know it's 6:59. Yeah. May Valli and I continue for 5 more minutes, or should we be taking questions?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Are we overstepping our time limit? I think someone needs to come on to unmute and let us know.
Madhu sir, unmute and talk. Madhu sir, unmute and talk.
Valli, hold your question. Please hold.
Madhu sir, please unmute.
Mr.
So do we have time? That's the point.
No, we're just finishing our time for the conversation.
Oh, okay.
So actually, there's just one question that has come. I think we're all too hypnotized listening to both of you that no questions are coming at the moment to our minds. So can I just go ahead with the question that has come up?
Yes,
or, yes. One
can we just finish?
Yes, sure.
Like one question I want to ask. Because you spoke of hierarchies. And so I just want to ask, as dancers, we have a great deal of reverence for our gurus. We look to them. I had a guru who gave me a foundation, strong foundation, but allowed me to fly. And I heard a great spiritual leader, say that the kind of guru one finds is largely the result of one's past karma. I just want to hear what you have to say about the guru and disciple relationship. And, this idea of hierarchy, I just would like to, it's a doubt which I have. So after that, I'll shut up.
No, you please don't shut up. I'll just pick up the phone and we have to continue this conversation. what does one say? I think it is so true that, especially if you have thirsted for many years for guidance, when that guidance comes, firstly, I must say it seems like many parched years when one seeks guidance of a certain kind. But when that guidance comes, and it comes in the form of a language and a presence that is so suited to your needs, your temperament, the gratitude for it is enormous, enormous. And at the same time, you also know you found an authentic guidance when you know that the guidance is not one that makes you dependent on it. When the person of the guru doesn't encourage you to become dependent on the person. In fact, you are being encouraged to move towards what I speak of in the book, Valli, which is presence. You're actually being guided from an external guru to an internal one. You're actually being guided from an unconscious enslavement. Many people are wary of the relationship with the guru because they believe it is one of enslavement. Instead, what any genuine guru, I think, brings to your life is an awareness of all the unconscious forms of enslavement that you have, in fact, been subjected to. All the conditioning, all the various voices in your head and in your books and in your educational systems and in your families, all the authority figures, everything that you have unconsciously been in servitude of, and helps you move from that unconscious servitude towards self-possession, towards, in fact, beginning to craft yourself. That is the journey, and I think that is the only index of an authentic journey.
You call it the roadmap back to yourself in your books. I was really struck by that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's just one question from Shabnam from Pennsylvania. Did the writing of this book change any dispositional tendencies within yourself? Your vagabondage, perhaps?
Thank you, Shabnam, for that. It's a good question. What has it changed? You know what it has changed? I think this, when I first listened, I said this to someone a couple of weeks ago. When I first heard, I sat in a goddess temple and I heard the various 33 names of the goddess being uttered in that temple. I just came away with a sense of some thirst that I wasn't even aware of, having been satiated, having been addressed. I had been parched without knowing it. So I think likewise with the writing of this book, I actually felt that some part of the self that had churned, that had fumed and fretted at all kinds of marginalization, all kinds of trivialization, was actually allowed its moment in the sun. By acknowledging others, this part of the self was actually nourished. I think that has changed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ranjita, could you please give the concluding remarks?
Thank you. Thank you, Jayanti. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Ranjita and everyone here.
Yes.
I know Zoom imposes a certain kind of formality, but I think Valli and I have been just trying to move away from that. So if there's anyone who just feels, let's just pause for a moment before we just conclude. Yeah. Because there is we have to allow pauses in all our conversations. Let's allow for a pause. If someone finds something that they want to say or ask at this point, can we just make room for that? We won't take too long.
Absolutely.
Yeah? Valli, that goes for you too. Mm-hmm. If there's anything that you feel
I
unsaid. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What an evening this has been at the Madras Book Club. We've been lifted and transported on a mystical journey by two extraordinary people, a poet and a dancer. their uniqueness acknowledged by all the accolades and awards showered upon them, both national and international. To connect with and speak from your soul through a word, a sentence, a mudra, a single glance, these are blessings that are not given to everyone. It has been an absolute privilege, Arundhathi Subramaniam and Alarmel Valli, to have both of you with us this evening. And the four mystics they spoke of, spiritual travelers, so far undocumented, pushed aside by prejudice, whose voices have now been heard. The incredible, the sheer self-belief and courage within what merely appears every day, where even skin odor indicates the presence of truth. Passion, intensity, symbolism, the entire process of shredding in order to transform, the dance and movement of language, be it words or dance, so much has been offered to us to think, to ponder, to learn from this evening by both of you, Arundhathi and Alarmel Valli. Thank you both for bringing these life-transforming stories to us. Listening to the flow of conversation between two people who inhabit a very special, intensely authentic creative universe, it's going to take all of us here a little while to float down. But unfortunately, time has its own rhythm. Thank you, Arundhathi and Alarmel Valli, for the gift of this evening. Before we close, on October 6th, we have Sir William Mark Tully, author, former Bureau Chief, BBC, New Delhi, in conversation with Mr. N. Ram on his book, Upcountry Tales. 27th October, we have journalist and writer Jaydeep Hatikar in conversation with Kavita Iyer on his book, Ram Rao, the story of India's farm crisis. As always, please unmute for a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you all very much. That was extraordinary. That was an absolutely extraordinary evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arundhathi. Thank you so much, Alarmel.
Thank you all for inviting me, and thank you, Arundhathi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and looking forward to conversations that continue. And to every one of you, thank you for being here. For Ranjita, a particularly sensitive closure to this evening. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.